All right, so we're starting off again. We're getting into population genetics. Now, if you guys remember, at the end of Bio 101, which could have been a very long time ago for some of you guys, you were learning about genetics. You were learning about Punnett squares. You know, if I mate with that person, what will the offspring look like? Are they going to be deformed? Are they going to be okay? What's happening? Um, you looked into that and you figured out for the individual what they will pass on to the next level. Today, we're moving beyond the individual and we're looking at the population as a whole. Because individuals never change over time. You are basically, your genome is set. And I say that for you introductory biology students. When you get to higher levels of biology, you're going to start learning about things called genomic plasticity, which throws all of this out the window because biology can get really complicated at higher levels. But for you at this level, what you are born with is what you are set with for your life. It doesn't change too much over time. At the population, though, level, you get some changes going on. What is a population? A population is a group of individuals of the same species that occupy the same environment at the same time. Do you guys know what these are? And if you say fish, I will smack you. No, you're out. Doesn't what? Salmon. Yeah, they're salmon. Salmon are ugly little creatures. These salmon routinely will swim out to the ocean, live their life in the ocean, and then when they are mature, they will swim back to the same river that they were spawned in and mate. It's a huge thing for the Alaskan ecosystem. They move in these large groups. They are all there at the same point to do one thing: mate, drop their gametes off, make little salmon. You guys ever been, anybody been to Alaska? I've been to Alaska. We'll talk about Alaska at the end of the course, but basically what ends up happening in Alaska is these salmon swim up and it becomes a smorgasbord for bears. Bears will just sit in the rivers and smack salmon. They're not even eating them. It's like a game. Just smack the salmon out of the river. Salmon lands on the ground. They go and gorge themselves. There's half-eaten salmon everywhere. It smells terrible. But what happens to those salmon after they've been smacked out of the river and they've been half-eaten? They can't reproduce, but in broader context, they begin to break down. They leave their nutrients behind. They form the basis of the terrestrial, the forest ecosystem in Alaska. Whatever, and of course the bears go around excreting things. Yeah, anyways. Salmon are important, but you're totally right. If they're knocked out of that water, they can't reproduce. Their genes are gone. I don't care if that was the biggest, sexiest fish out there. It's not able to mate because it got knocked out. The rest of these guys, though, in that river at that time are one population. It is all about sex. In case you guys missed that, also, in case any of you don't understand how sex works, we can talk after class sometime. I'm just saying, I've had to walk a few students through it because they were homeschooled. I don't know what's going on with that. So, most populations, in biological terms, are defined by who they can mate with, through, creating viable offspring through sexual reproduction. This is a herd of horses, not trying to trick you. They can all mate with each other. What do horses, when they mate with each other, produce? Horses. A horse makes a horse makes a horse. What, though, happens when you have a horse that mates with a donkey? You get a mule. Can a mule mate? Well, it can mate. Can it produce an offspring? No. So, because of that, even if horses and donkeys are in the same area, they are not a population because they can't produce fertile offspring. So we're defining the population not just by are you in the same place at the same time, but also can you produce fertile offspring? If you got locked in the zoo with a monkey, you're not going to produce any fertile offspring with it. Even though you're in the same place at the same time, you're not the same population. Think about in your world, right? Typically, for you guys, if you were to mate with anybody, and I'm not suggesting you go do it, you're going to mate with somebody locally. Likely, you're not going to meet somebody in a different, different country on a different continent and go and mate with them. I mean, it's possible. It's possible. You're right. It is possible. But typically, you're going to mate with the organisms in the area around you. These populations change over time. So time becomes an issue. You are not an unchanging group. We could start a population with a bunch of green frogs and a brown frog. But let's say those green frogs become very easy prey for crows. I don't know, because they're not on brown logs. If that's the case, in future generations, you're going to see a change in the population dynamic. And we saw that in the lab last week, right? The lima beans were eaten down when they were selected against. Over time, populations change. They will only change, though, if you have what are known as polymorphisms within that population. Again, back to that lima bean experiment. You saw populations change over time when there was variation. That first experiment we ran that was just like lima bean after lima bean after lima bean and nothing else but lima beans, what came in the second generation? If you only have lima beans, not trying to trick you, and you guys can talk back, it's okay. Lima beans, thanks. Sorry, I have to keep myself entertained too. You get lima beans. You need changes, and those differences, those new forms are called polymorphs. Poly means many, morph means form. So new variation in a population is called a polymorphism. Here we've got sheep. You've got some white sheep and you got some black sheep. These are polymorphs, two different forms. Think about sheep. What color were sheep? What color are sheep usually? White. Have they always been white? Nope. It is not to that sheep's advantage to be white. We bred them to be that way through artificial selection. Why would we want white sheep? Say it again. It's very visible and easier to dye wool. So we got two big things. If you're out there with your shepherd's crook standing on a hill looking out into the trees and wherever your herd is, you want to be able to easily spot those sheep. Way easier to see a big white thing on a green environment than to see black things that look like shadows. So at some point in the past, there was a polymorphism. This white form appeared, and our ancestors said, let's pick that one. And we bred it, and we bred it, and we bred it, and now we have lots and lots of white sheep with fewer black sheep. These polymorphisms are caused by genes. Specifically, they're caused by genes that exist as two or more forms called alleles. Do alleles sound familiar to you? Do you remember that term from Bio 101? An allele is an alternate form of a gene. We've got here a bunch of snails. And it may not seem mind-blowing, but if you look at these snails, some of their shells are going to spiral in one direction and some spiral in the other. The direction a snail's, this is so hard to say. The direction a snail's shell spirals, it's alliteration if you ever need to use a term for an English assignment. A snail's shell spirals is totally determined by exactly one gene, one variant of a gene. Alleles are really important for understanding. The most common alleles are single nucleotide polymorphisms. Big long word. So we shorten it to a SNP, SNP. Single nucleotide polymorphisms. Do you ever blah, 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 blah. What is a nucleotide? From Bio 101. I know, I expect you to remember things. Yes, it's the building block of the nucleic acids. Good job. Yeah, thanks. So if you have a genetic sequence of, say, I don't know, GATTACA, and then this is the normal DNA, the polymorph, the single nucleotide polymorphism, might be GTTTACA. There's a single nucleotide change, a single nucleotide polymorphism. This is by far the most common type of polymorphism, the most common type of allele. is one change in one nucleotide. Usually, how many amino acids will that impact on the gene that on the protein that it forms? One, usually, unless it's in the start or the stop codon. I'm using all these terms from 101. I'm hoping you remember. If not, just stop me and I'll go back over them. So that single nucleotide polymorphism typically will change one amino acid. Remember, each amino acid that makes up a protein has certain chemical values to it. And it's what causes the form of the protein. It gives it a certain shape. And this is a big, big, huge concept from Bio 101 that will keep popping up in Bio 102. What happens when you change the form? What also changes? Starts with an F. You guys ever hear form determines function? Okay, guess what? Memorize this. It will be your mantra for living in the future. Form determines function. In all of biology, the form of the organism determines its function. The form of the molecule determines its function. Basically, if you have a certain shape, that's what gives it its function. So if you've changed the shape of a protein, you've changed the form, what else have you changed? Its function. Make sense? So we get these single nucleotide polymorphisms when you've either replaced a nucleotide or when you've added one or deleted one. Back in Bio 101, you probably remember, I hope, maybe, about, it's at the very end, so you may not. If you add a nucleotide or you remove a nucleotide, that will change what's called the reading frame. And that will usually break a protein. It makes it so that all the amino acids after that are changed. It gives you an entirely new amino acid sequence. The vast majority of time when that happens, that type of mutation leads to, it's deleterious. It leads to a stop of function. But sometimes, very rarely, but sometimes, it leads to a gain of function. It gives you something new. And that leads to enormous variation in life. You could go from being a red flower to being a blue flower because of that change. 1 in a billion chance, but when all of these things are happening all of the time, every second of every day, 1 in a billion becomes a little bit more common than you'd think. And it all comes down to alleles, variant forms of genes. Now, it's just not single nucleotide polymorphisms are one type of allele, but alleles can be any type of change in a gene. Here we've got 2 chromosomes. It's a homologous pair, if you remember that. You get one from mom, you get one from dad. Here you can see in this area, this locus, you got tall and tall. They are the same allele. The trait it's coding for is height. Tall, tall. Here you got wrinkled and smooth. The trait is texture. You got 2 different ones, which means these are different alleles. A different genetic sequence. The only way you can determine, and this is just in general about genes, the earliest ways, we'll say, you could determine the function of a gene, now we use computer modeling to figure out what its form is to lead to its function, was to figure out differences in alleles. It was so important. Sidebar, here's my life. So I was in graduate school 20 years ago, and it seems so long ago, but I was in graduate school 20 years ago. And I, like you, was just, moving forward in my education, and I was in love with this girl. I married her, and then shortly after I got into graduate school, she was pregnant because, let's be honest, I had no money. We couldn't afford birth control. It was rough. And so she got pregnant. We had a kid. While I was in school, it was, a $26,000 child. Without insurance, don't have a kid. That's my advice to you. That kid, when my wife was in the hospital, she said, I don't want any medication or drugs. I can do this naturally. She's like, I'm going to have this kid. I don't want drugs. It'll be great. No, it's not going to be great, but it's going to happen. Then we got in there, and turns out labor is very painful. So she got drugs very quickly. She had an epidural. She had the kid. She went to sleep, and she and I were discussing about what to name the kid, and she said I wanted to name the kid Allele because I was like that'd be a really cool name, and then she's like, no, we're not doing that to a child. So I know, right? She said we're going to name the kid Kira. And I said, I don't want to name her Kira. I'm going to name her Victoria Jean. That was my next one, Victoria, and then Jean, Gene, and I was like, that's so cool. She didn't think so. So she was going to be named Kira. I forget what Kira's middle, like it might have been Kira Marie. And I said, okay, whatever. Well, she was unconscious, and then they brought in the paperwork to sign that says, okay, well, congratulations on having this child. What are you going to name it? And I said, I will name her Kira because that's what her mother wants her to be called. Kira Allele. And I thought that was so cool. So I filled out all the paperwork, and now I have a daughter, and her name's Kira Allele. But think about that. If you name the kid Allele, I was thinking way ahead. One, to when she got to biology, and she could be like, my middle name's Allele, because that's kind of fun. Except she hates biology now. But if you spell it in cursive, it goes like this. Basically, right? It's just a lot of loops. Fun story. There you go. So alleles are so important to biology that I did in fact name my child after it. These alleles could be in two different forms. They could be homozygous or they could be heterozygous. If you've got alleles that are homozygous, that means they are the same. Big B, they are producing the exact same genetic sequence. Those that are different are going to be termed heterozygous. Big B, little b. You guys remember this? I'm just sort of reviewing. Awesome. So there we go. Now, do you guys have any questions? No? Nobody has any questions right now at all? None? Cool. Hey, Sasha, what's an allele? You rock! Well done, a variant form of a gene. All right. We'll go with Michael. What is the most common genetic mutation? That's exactly it, a single nucleotide polymorphism. Speaking of which, I'm going to go with Skylar because I like you. What is a polymorphism? That is textbook exam. Yeah, I wouldn't even have been able to do that. Well done. Genes that exist as two or more variants in a population. Speaking of populations, Carly, what's a population in general? Yep, group of same species that live together and more importantly, mate together. And then Maria, just because I still remember your name, what is the difference between a homozygote and a heterozygote? You got yeah. So homozygotes have two of the same. Heterozygotes have two different alleles. You guys rock. There are the credits.